Returning to our top story, the death of North Korean leader Kim Jong-il. It was one of the subjects for discussion when I spoke to New Zealand Prime Minister John Key a little earlier today. We also look back on his election victory and the controversy surrounding the so-called teapot tapes. Mr Key joined us from Wellington. John Key, thanks for talking to the world and congratulations on your recent re-election.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it was a great night for the National Party and obviously delighted to be back in our second term now leading New Zealand. So a lot of challenges in front of us, but very much looking forward to the task at hand.
I'd like to talk to you more about your election win in a moment, but first, can I ask you about today's major international news story? What's your reaction to the news of the death of Kim Jong-il?
Well, I think the world will be looking on rather nervously. I mean, we don't know very much about his son, who is now assuming control. We know that when he did start exercising some power recently, he used that in a way that we believe was very disruptive to South Korea or to Korea, may well have been linked to the sinking of the Chonan. So I think the world will be looking with a great deal of trepidation about what may lay ahead of us. And we'll be hoping, of course, that the new leader improves the conditions on the ground for everyday North Koreans, because they've certainly suffered a great deal in the last 10 to 20 years.
Former US President George W. Bush memorably labelled the North Korean regime as part of the axis of evil. Do you feel any sadness today at Kim Jong-il's passing?
I don't think sadness is the adjective I'd use. I mean, we know very little about him. I really have only sort of experienced it in so much that I went up to the border when I was in Korea once, and then ultimately what I've seen on the TV sets, it's a very hermit-like regime. We don't know much about North Korea other than that it's delivered abysmal results for its people. So I wouldn't use sadness as the word. I mean, I am, like everybody else, just somewhat concerned that things could escalate, obviously, on the Korean peninsula, and we'll be looking very closely at that and supporting our good friends, the Koreans.
So what message do you pass to Kim Jong-il's chosen successor today, his son Kim Jong-un?
Well, I think North Korea has to change. I mean, people are not doing well. There's mass starvation. People live in some of the worst conditions in the world. And quite frankly, it's a failed experiment. And I think in that regard, North Korea needs to dramatically change. They've got the opportunity to do that. The rest of Asia is emerging very rapidly. So I think in that regard, from an economic perspective, there's a lot of gains to be made. I think secondly, the message very loud and clear has to be that there's no place for his nuclear program, and that presents real threats. Next year, Korea is hosting the second of the nuclear security summits, and there's an obvious reason why it's been hosted in Seoul, and that is the potential threat that North Korea poses. So the worrying factors, as I say, we know very little about the son that is assuming control, but we do know that he's likely to have been behind some of those attacks on South Korea recently, and that's of great concern.
Would you call on China to use its influence over North Korea at this time for the sake of the stability of the region?
The Chinese have obviously got a link into North Korea. The North Koreans will talk to them, and you would hope over time take some messages away from whatever they talk to them about. So in that regard, I think, yes, China is the likely linchpin if we're going to see change in North Korea, or at least a friendlier, more open regime.
John Key, I'd also like to ask you about the latest asylum seeker boat tragedy in the seas off Indonesia. What do you believe needs to be done to stop desperate people putting to sea in unseaworthy, overloaded boats?
Well, obviously, we've got to do more to try and stop that position in the first place. And, I have great sympathy for the Australians who are obviously subjected and targeted by the boat people. I mean, let's be honest, these are people that traffic in human misery. They are preying on people who are very vulnerable and obviously and naturally want a better standard and quality of living than the one that they've got. But in taking part in these voyages, well, many of them are losing their lives. So, at the end of the day, I think we do have to come up with a better solution to this, but it's the enormity of the problem at one level. And now the sophistication of it. We're seeing much larger boats. We've seen boats get to Canada. We know that they are targeting New Zealand. That's a much more adventurous, more difficult voyage, but we know eventually New Zealand will also become a place, I think, that you are like to see boat people. But very tragic that they've lost their lives today.
Well, of course, there's vigorous debate here in Australia, as you would no doubt know, about whether asylum seekers should be processed here in Australia or sent elsewhere. What's your view?
Well, that's a matter for the Australian government, and we don't interfere in that process. I mean, I have had a number of discussions with Julia Gillard in the time that she's been Prime Minister, and said that New Zealand's prepared to look at this issue on a regional or from a regional perspective. As I say, I don't think New Zealand's immune from the problem, although it's much harder to get to New Zealand. We've been happy to have those discussions, but at this point, how Australia processes people that are illegally attempting to enter Australia is a matter for the Australian government.
Well, to put this tragedy into some kind of context, it's believed around 180 people have drowned in this sinking. That's about the same number of lives lost in the Christchurch earthquake.
Yeah, I mean, it's a horrible thing, and it's tragic, and it shows the desperation of the people involved. I think no one's arguing about the motivations of those that would seek a better life, and whether it's Australia or New Zealand or Canada or any other part of the developed world. It's one of the reasons why, as countries, we both support the UN HCR program. We take refugees, and I think we're quite generous in the way that we look to resettle people in our countries. The issue is how you deal with the process that's legally occurring vis-a-vis those that would look to short-circuit the system. And, both New Zealand and Australia, I think, have fiercely defended its right to take people legally and to make sure that there is a real and proper process, because the enormity of those looking to seek asylum is overwhelming and daunting for even a very large country like Australia. So, this is never easy politics.
And as you made clear earlier this year, asylum seekers attempting to reach New Zealand by boat aren't welcome.
Correct. And the reason for that is we do welcome genuine refugees, and we do welcome those that, as I say, come through the front door. And we do a lot to try and resettle them and give them every chance in life to be successful. And many of those that come to New Zealand as part of that program have gone on to be very successful. As you know, New Zealand took people off the Tampa as, again, part of our, ultimately UNHCR quota, I think, around that time. But the real issue here is how you differentiate between those who are illegally looking to jump the queue and how you deal with those that are genuinely part of the UNHCR program. And that is a big issue for somewhere like Australia, where your proximity is so close to those in Indonesia and other parts of the world looking to smuggle people.
John Key, I'd like to ask you now about the year that was in New Zealand. It's been a year filled with tragedy and triumph for you personally, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been a tough year, 2011. We've had pretty much everything you can imagine thrown at us, from the remnants of the global financial crisis, obviously the earthquakes in Christchurch, which claimed the lives of 181 people. You've had the Rena, which was a very large cargo ship that got stranded on a reef, the Astrolabe Reef outside Tauranga, and spilt hundreds of tons of heavy fuel oil into the water. At one point we had a small tornado here. You kind of name it, I think we've experienced it. So it's been a pretty tough time. But I always say, at the worst of times, you see the very best of New Zealanders. And I, as the leader of the country, very proud of my fellow New Zealanders, the way they stood up and supported one another and the generosity they showed, both financially and in human spirit.
Commentators have suggested that your second term in power won't be as easy as your first. Do you agree? Is this where the really hard work starts for John Key?
Well, I'd say the last 3 years were pretty tough. I mean, we dealt with an enormous number of issues. As say, the global financial crisis was, dominated the first 18 months, and the back half was the tragedies of the earthquake, Pike River mine disaster, and others. But I think inevitably a second term is always more challenging, in so much that the media will tend to harden up a little bit. That's always what sort of typically happens. You've got longer in the job, and so people's expectations of seeing results are more defined. And, it's just typically a harder road to hoe. But having said all that, we delivered a spectacular result a couple of weeks ago. We lifted our vote in government, which has only happened 3 times in the last 121 years that a government in office has actually lifted its vote. So, I think we've got the goodwill of the New Zealand public. We just need to work hard to lift the economic performance of the country.
One newspaper in your country has dubbed you Politician of the Year. As compliments go, is that a bit of a backhanded one? And if it is, does it bother you that you're perceived that way?
It doesn't bother me. Quite a number of them have named me that, but I think largely because we won the election with such a big majority, they would probably argue there's some things I've done well and some things I've done badly, and that's true of any politician, I guess. I mean, my focus isn't really that much on whether I become Politician of the Year or not next year. My focus is on whether we deliver what we campaigned on, and that is very much welfare reform. Too many New Zealanders on a benefit in our view. lifting economic competitiveness, a lot of work to be done there. We're going to embark on a program of what's called mixed ownership model or partial privatisation. Crown will keep a majority stake, but we're going to sell 49% of 4 large state-owned companies here. We've got major reform of the public sector to undertake. So it's going to be a very busy time along with the rebuilding of Christchurch.
Certainly the election campaign didn't go all your way. You were enmeshed in one controversy involving the accidental sound recording of your conversation with one of your coalition partners. You've opposed the release of that recording. Why do you say that shouldn't be released?
Yeah, because we would take issue with the one word you used, which was accidental. In our view, it was a deliberate action by that cameraman to get audio on the conversation. I really am not that fazed by what's on the tape. In fact, those who've heard it have described it as bland and boring. There was nothing on that tape that I was terribly bothered about. But my view is that it was very much tabloid tactics. I think it was very much where the News of the World started. It might not have been where they finished, but it was certainly where they started. And if I basically reward what I think is very poor behaviour and a lack of ethics by that particular journalist, then I'm simply rewarding the wrong kind of behaviour, and I, for one, wasn't going to allow that to happen.
But is the key difference the fact that the conversation actually took place, that it's now a matter of public record? If, as you say, the so-called teapot tapes are bland and boring, why not publicly release them?
Well, for the very reason I said to you. I mean, once you start down that road, that means any conversation is now legitimate. So next time we have a bilateral meeting and Julia Gillard comes to New Zealand and all the press come in to shake hands as they do and record some of the early footage, would that mean if someone, quote unquote, accidentally left a recording device in there, that footage would then be legitimately in the public domain? I don't think any self-respecting journalist or news organisation would argue that that's the case. There was no argument that the meeting was taking place. We called the media there, but there was a public component of that and a private component of that, just as it is, as I say, when I meet Julia Gillard, there's very often a private component and a public component. But look, in my view, we as politicians and you as the news media have a set of ethics that we expect each other to operate under, and I think that's well understood. Once you cross that line and there is no line, then as far as I'm concerned, chaos rules, and I'm just not, for one, prepared to sanction that.